Okay, so just a quick reminder, get the vocab quiz done by midnight Sunday. I don't feel like I really need to remind you all of this because you tend to do it anyway. I don't really, know whether I tell you to do it or not. But yeah, I promise it'll be there on time too. It'll be there when I say it's going to be there, not later. I'll check those default settings in Georgia View before I try to post this. And for next time, you're going to be reading Christina Rossetti's poem "Goblin Market," which is going to involve a lot of the discourses regarding Victorian women's lives that we're going to talk about today. And also, we're going to talk a lot about Victorian fairy tales, because it's kind of part of that general discourse as well. But does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started? Okay, then let's look at the paper assignment that I just gave you. So, paper 2 is going to be a 3-part assignment. The first thing you're going to give me is an annotated bibliography. Does everyone know what an annotated bibliography is? Has everyone done one before?
Where's the best place
Okay,
to
good. Everyone has done one.
Pants
Great.
everywhere, because Skechers.
So I want you to do the research for this first, right? Before you come up with an argument, right? Before you try to formulate a thesis. Have a general idea what you want to write about, have your 2 texts picked out in a broad theme, but let the research guide you. You're going to pick 2 texts, one from the earlier half of the course, so something from before midterm, and the other has to come from the latter half of the course. They must both deal with the same broad theme. You have to pick something you haven't worked on yet as well. So it can't be the same text you wrote about for paper 1, and it can't be the same text you're doing your presentation on. Using your secondary sources, you're going to come up with an argument that accounts for the continuity or difference in the way these texts treat the same big idea. So the order of assignment here is annotated bibliography, and the due dates we see here are on the last page. That's going to be due on Friday, the 18th of November. You're going to do a 500-word proposal, which will be similar to the proposal you did for paper 1. That's going to be due on Monday, the 28th. And the final paper is going to be due on Wednesday, December 7th, which is a date that I mostly chose to interfere with the final exam as little as possible. So take a minute, look this over, and let me know if you have any questions before we proceed. I will give everyone, by the way, a sample annotated bibliography to use as a template. I know, you've done them before, you know what they're supposed to look like, but just know that that is also available to you. in case I didn't mention it on the sheet, the same rules apply regarding the writing center as well. So if you go to the writing center, or at least can present evidence that you tried to go to the writing center, you will get you'll get bonus points on paper.
On this part about all of our quotations from both of our sources, do we have to have at least one quote from every single source, or just as long as we're quoting most of our sources? We'll use them, regardless, even if we paraphrase parts of it. But
I would say try to have a direct quote from at least 3 of your sources.
Okay.
Okay, in the proposal, what do you mean by including a brief overview of the current state of scholarship on the question that you choose, or the question that you have?
Okay, so what I mean by that is what's the so you're going to look at your sources first, right? You're going to do the antecedent bibliography first, and what you're going to give me is kind of the general consensus view that your sources have about this particular topic, right? So what is the kind of base level view, the base level argument everybody makes about this particular theme, as it might be represented in these particular pieces. Does that make sense?
Yes. So you would write a sentence that says most thinkers on some topic in particular use that blah blah. Okay.
Yeah. And one thing that'll do is it might actually give you a viewpoint to either to develop, right? Okay, so this is what they all see, but here's what I think they might be missing. And then you can kind of add something to the conversation, right? Or you can use it as something to react against, right? This is what the consensus view is. However, I think it might be wrong based on X, Y, and or Z, right? So that can help you develop a thesis of your own. All right. Other questions that y'all have?
This says include a short 5-sentence paragraph that describes each source. Is that a paragraph for each source itself?
For each individual source.
Okay.
Yep. And like I said, I'll give you a sample to use as a template.
it says here for the thing that our primary sources don't need to be on the annotated bibliography, but they do need to be on the works cited page. So do we need all of the other sources put on our works cited page as well, just without their additional paragraphs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So yeah, your works cited page will be all of the things on your annotated bibliography that I have approved, like one of the reasons I want to see it first is that I want to make sure that all of the sources you're using are appropriate for the assignment, right? And yeah, so everything that is on the annotated bibliography, everything that you actually cite in the paper should be on the works cited page. But yeah, you don't need to give me your 2 primary sources because, like, duh, right? And as with the presentations, right, like if you need any help with the research, right, I'm happy to help you, but I know also that John Wilson has worked with students on this assignment before and can help you out if you shoot him an email and make an appointment. Y'all are so responsible annotating the assignment.
Well, there's no point in asking the same questions twice, so.
Yeah. Less patient instructors might get mad. Okay, so do we have any other questions? Are we good? For now? And again, my intent here is not to stress you out with the massiveness of this assignment, right? I want to make sure that you have enough time to get it all done. So, right, the annotated bibliography is due in a month. The paper itself is due in about 6 weeks. So, that's still a good chunk of time, but don't let that time get away from you, right? It's probably good to start thinking at least about a theme that you want to try to develop within the next week or so. Okay, so I want to start today's conversation with a picture. Of the British royal family around 1850. Now, what do we know about the royal family around 1850? Who is the ruler of England? Who is the English monarch in 1850? What's the period called?
Victorian. I thought you were looking for the king. I was like, I don't know his name.
But it's interesting that that's the way you thought,
Yeah,
right?
I was thinking the king as well. Like,
What-
was it Charles?
Was there a king during the Victorian period?
I'm assuming no.
The answer is no. Yes, Victoria's husband was much like Queen Elizabeth II, right? Prince Philip was her husband, right? He was the prince consort. She outranked him. Prince Albert was Queen Victoria's husband, right? He was the prince consort. So this is a picture of the entire royal family. Husband, wife, all the children. Who looks like the most important figure in this portrait? And why?
Prince Albert, who you said in the middle, and they're all surrounding him.
Yeah, he's right in the middle. He's the tallest figure, right? So the composition is almost like, everybody is kind of flat here in terms of where their heads are, but his is just slightly above everyone else's, right? He's looking forward, but not quite at the viewer, right? He's looking slightly off to the side, like he's a little bit too good to be looking at you common troll. And what do you notice about his posture?
He seems like pretty straight and confident. I don't know.
Yeah, like ramrod straight, right? He's got his hand on this pedestal here. He's posed. like a king, right? At the at the very like the king of this little household, or well, not little households. God, that's a lot of kids. Where's the queen?
She's off to the side.
Yeah,
Well,
he's looking not quite at us. Who's she looking at? Which figure do you think is the queen?
Would it be the one on the left? Or is that not her?
You're thinking this one?
Mm-hmm.
Good guess, but that's actually one of the daughters.
Really?
Yeah. So where's the queen?
Is she the one behind it?
it's like, are you talking about like on their right, our left?
Yeah. Go with Go with my left and my right.
Okay.
It's gonna be easier for me.
Okay.
Your left?
You mean this figure?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's the queen. So what's weird about this?
Well, she looks like one of the kids.
Okay, yeah, I mean, well, yeah, and this is like Queen Victoria was physically tiny, right? She was a very small woman.
Wow.
But what else is weird about the way this picture is set up?
She's like looking at him almost.
Yeah, he's looking kind of at us, she's looking at him. And they're surrounded by their offspring, right? Now, does anybody remember what we said several weeks ago when we talked about Dorothy Wordsworth about ideology and what ideology is?
It's like that set of common values that society just adopts at large.
Yeah, and where does it tend to filter down from?
The top rings of high society.
Yeah, the values of the upper classes tend to filter down to everybody else, right? And what we have here is an illustration of Victorian ideology as regards gender roles. Prince Albert is not the King of England or anywhere else. Queen Victoria is, in fact, the queen of an empire. But she depicts herself here as humble wife and mother, subservient to tall, bold husband, right? And the royal family really is kind of like the model on which the English middle classes in particular base their own kind of family ideal, right? And based on this picture, what do you think that ideal in family relationships and gender relationships looks like? You know, maybe kind of bring in some of the reading you did for today as well. I'm thinking about this.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Okay,
you
sure.
asked?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So, based on this picture, right, what do you think Victorians thought about gender roles in the family?
I think one thing would be like look to your husband or your father like for leadership and maybe protection and like kind of
Yeah.
they have more authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's also the most rigid figure in the picture, right? With the ramrod straight back.
Also,
Ass-
you got it.
Okay, assuming that that is a boy right next to Queen Victoria with the suit. Yes.
Yeah.
Similar to his
Yeah.
figure, like his posture is similar to his father's. So
Yeah.
and they're also looking kind of in the same direction. So being that
Yeah.
the girl and all the girls looking towards their dad,
Uh-huh.
it seems that obviously the boys in the family, the men in the family, are
Yeah.
respected more.
The two older boys, right? I mean,
Yeah.
one of them is even wearing a military uniform, even though he
Yes.
doesn't look like he's an adult yet. That's the older son.
They definitely see.
And the other children, with Victorian children, it's not always easy to tell what their gender is because they tended to be dressed alike, whether boys or girls. And children typically had long hair. Again, regardless of gender. But yeah, the older boys are definitely like kind of mimicking their father. This one in particular, yeah. Looks very much like Daddy. And yeah, many of the girls are looking to their brothers, much like mother is looking at father, yeah.
Up to the only one that isn't, once again, assuming that is the girl that we thought was the queen, she's the only one that's not looking towards her father.
Yeah, it's
Other than the other kids.
the eldest daughter, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Prince Albert is right smack dab in the middle of the picture, right? Everything here revolves around father.
This is kind of a little bit of a random question, but how, if he was married to the queen, would he not be a king? Like, how is he still considered a prince, as opposed to?
It had to do with social rank.
Okay.
So essentially, like he was not quite as noble as she was, right? They both came from old aristocratic families, but hers ranked higher than his did.
Okay.
So yeah, typically when that happens, when the consort is a prince or princess rather than a king or queen, it means that there is a difference in social rank when they marry.
I think also if he would become, I think if he would have the title king, he would outrank her as well. So, and that couldn't happen because she's of the more noble blood.
Yeah. But this is basically the image of family that is imprinted on Victorian society for particularly the early part of Victoria's reign. Prince Albert dies, I think, in 1861. And from that point, Victoria ceases to be exemplary wife and mother to the nation and becomes, for the next 40 years of her life, the exemplary widow. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on here and try to break this down. So, Victorian gender discourse, right, essentially argues that men and women operate in completely different spheres. So the man's sphere is the world. The woman's sphere is the home. Men are regarded as intellectually superior, but morally inferior. Whereas women were regarded as intellectually inferior, but morally superior. So what the woman was supposed to provide for her husband was a safe and stable and comfortable home, and also a kind of moral center, right? And when we look at the Sarah Stickney Ellis piece, I think we'll see how some of this works out in practice. But yeah, this was the basic idea. And like, this is, by the way, all kind of done on very, very specious physical evidence. Like, you remember how Ebenezer Scrooge needed to have like material evidence for everything that he believed. This is actually a pretty common Victorian problem. And the evidence for the intellectual superiority of men was that our brains are slightly larger. Now, we know now that the size of one's brain actually has nothing to do with intelligence. Our brains are a little bigger because our heads are a little bigger. That's it. And if men were at all intellectually superior to women, it was largely a matter of the different educations and the different kinds of social conditioning that men and women received. So, how do you think a typical middle-class Victorian woman spent her time? What do you think she did all day?
All I can envision her drinking tea. Sitting in the parlor with her other friends and just gossiping about neighborhood turmoil.
Doing chores and taking care of the children.
Working class women would have done that.
Okay.
However, middle class women who had enough money not to typically did not. Their lives are actually much more like what Ryland just suggested. So yeah, middle class women didn't really do a whole hell of a lot during the day. Servants did most of the housework. Now, the woman was expected to manage the home, basically manage the servants, right? But yeah, like her capacity was entirely supervisory, right? And I think that this is something that we often kind of get wrong about 19th century women's lives, is that like at least like a woman who's doing housework all day is doing something, right? It's not really until the 20th century and the invention of appliances that can replace servants, right? You got an electric vacuum cleaner that can vacuum up your floor, get the dirt off your floors, an electric oven on which to prepare meals, washer and dryer, a dishwasher, right? So when these electric appliances come along, you no longer need to hire servants to do those jobs. They can all be done by one person. However, if it's what you do during the day, right, it takes you all day to do all of those things. So when women in the Victorian era were kind of stuck in the home, it was really more a result of ideology than it was due to any kind of practical need for their presence. And again, when we say women here, remember that we're referring specifically here to the middle classes. Working class women's lives were quite different. So, now where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought again. Okay, so women were to be kept innocent of the corrupting influence of the world. Right. Sending them out into the world might reduce their goodness in some way, right? So this is kind of a reversal here of medieval misogyny, right? So in the Middle Ages, because Eve had tempted Adam with the apple, woman was regarded as a base temptress, right? A vile creature that had caused man to fall. So the Victorian view is still misogynistic, but in a different way, right? Instead of at least like giving women some credit for having some agency, the Victorian man says that woman is too weak to go out into the world for herself, and so it must be put on a pedestal and protected, right? And guarded, and must be a kind of secondary conscience or a secondary moral compass for her husband and her sons. And we get a good sense of this kind of ideology if we look at the Coventry Patmore poem on page 659, The Angel in the House. So what did y'all think of this? I mean, this is only an excerpt from a very, very long poem. A very interminably long poem that has fallen out of favor with modern readers, but was incredibly popular with Victorians. So what did y'all think of this poem, or this excerpt from this poem?
That his word kind of lofty a little bit.
What's that?
His wording was lofty.
Okay.
And,
Can you give me an example?
Right here is line 39. Nor happier post than this I ask, live a laureate all my life, on wings of love uplifted free, and by her gentleness made great. I'll teach how no man should be to match with such a lovely maid. Like, come on. Yeah.
Okay. So, like, what does it present the wife as then?
Kind of like a trophy, like put on a shelf and admire.
Yeah, something to aspire to and win, right? Yeah, and a lot of this comes out of, just as we kind of talked about how like this is the moral nature of men and women is a reversal of the medieval attitude. What Patmore and others like him are promoting is an idea that is actually based in a medieval literary trope, with all of the naughty bits taken out. A lot of the Victorians were really big on taking the naughty and dirty bits out of things. For example, I don't know if you've ever heard the term Bowdlerize before. Okay, so to Bowdlerize something means to basically kind of sanitize something until it's not interesting anymore. And there was a guy by the name of Thomas Bowdler who published an edition of what he called the Family Shakespeare, which basically was Shakespeare's plays, but he took all of the sex and violence out of them, which basically means that absolutely nothing happens. So the trope that Patmore is adapting here for his purposes was called courtly love, or fin amour. Have any of you heard of courtly love before? Is this something that anybody's familiar with, this concept?
It's like when you're courting someone.
Well, kind of, but not quite, right? So in a courtly love narrative, you had a knight in love with a lady. And the knight performs great deeds to win the lady's favors. And I think we can all infer what is meant here by favors. Now, in these medieval narratives, the courtly love relationship always happens outside of marriage. The knight and the lady are probably each married to someone else. And in part, this is because of the very different nature of medieval marriage, right? So, in the Middle Ages, typically the only people who got married were aristocrats because they were the only people who owned any property. And the primary purpose of marriage and of the preservation of chastity was so that a man could be sure that he was passing his property down to his own biological heirs, rather than raising someone else's little cuckoos in the nest, right? So that's the part that Patmore takes out of this, right? That's the part that gets Baudelarized here. And Patmore is placing this kind of same basic idea where the man improves himself to prove himself worthy of a beautiful mate, to become his wife, right? Not to become his secret mistress. And this is so that in this phrase, the angel in the house, from the early 1860s onward, kind of enters the Victorian vocabulary as a kind of synonym for the perfect wife and mother. Now, I think we can probably get a good sense of what the Victorians thought this perfect wife and mother looked like and how she thought if we look at the Sarah Stickney Ellis piece. So before I say anything about this, what did you think about Stickney Ellis's ideas about women's role in the family and about women's education? She is writing, by the way, in the early part of the Victorian period. This her book, The Women of England, is published in 1839. So about 20 years before Patmore.
I thought it was an interesting piece because I feel like some of the things that she said could definitely be true as far as like in the home, like that does have a big influence on like how people see the world and like so there is influence that comes with that, but the idea that like someone can't also like have intellectual like ability, I don't necessarily agree with that part of it,
Yeah. And I mean, there is this kind of interesting idea from the beginning of this excerpt, right? That the natural rottenness of men has to be counteracted by the natural goodness and sweetness of women, right? And when she talks about her sort of ideal form of education for girls, right? What does she think girls need to be taught? How does she think girls need to be taught?
She was talking about like a disinterested kindness, like
let's pull that term out here for a second, right? Disinterested kindness. What does she mean by that? What is disinterested kindness?
Is it like you don't need to have a motive to be kind in a way?
Exactly. That's exactly what she means, right? It's kindness for the sake of kindness, right? Without any hope of personal gain. sound like anything we've encountered before?
In regards to how women are viewed,
Uh-huh.
it sounds like the ideology in the Dorothy Wars were her journals.
Yeah.
I can't think of the name of it, obviously.
Is this what you're thinking of?
Yeah, it's vocational philanthropy.
Yes. Good. Right, that idea that women should do their work out of love, right? Not because they hoped to gain from it, not for money, right? No, Dorothy Wordsworth mends William's waistcoat and cuts his pens and takes dictation and throws his apple cores into the fire, right? Out of love, not out of any hope for financial reward or any other kind of reward, really, right? So, yeah, women were supposed to do what they did out of love for their families. And yeah, this disinterested kindness idea in Ellis's piece is really, it's just another way of framing more or less the same thing, right? Except that she's applying it more broadly, right? That women should be taught to be kind to everybody, not just to their families. Although we will note momentarily that there is a notable exception to this rule. The angel in the house has a dark opposite as well, with whom she must not associate. But yes, so is there anything weird to you about the way she suggests that this particular form of education is proper to women?
Well, it says that a man would rather his wife be free from selfishness than be able to read, like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So,
Rather than be able to read at all.
Yeah.
But let's go to that paragraph here. So, let us single out from any particular seminary a child who has been there from the years of 10 to 15 and reckon, if it can be reckoned, the pains that have been spent in making that child proficient in Latin. Have the same pains been spent in making her disinterestedly kind? And yet what man is there in existence who would not rather his wife should be free from selfishness than be able to read Virgil without the use of a dictionary? So what's the assumption she's making about why a girl is educated in the first place?
You're only educated to serve your husband or the man in the family.
Yeah. Who doesn't require an education that stresses disinterested kindness? She doesn't suggest this for boys, right?
No.
Even though, one could argue that, maybe teaching everybody to be a little bit more kind would not be a bad thing, right? But yeah, this is a course of education that she only suggests for girls. And I think that a lot of it is because of this pervasive notion that men and women have these very separate sets of natural abilities and natural attributes and need to be trained for their proper spheres, right? So yes, men should learn to read Virgil without a dictionary, but not women. And I think we can see how pervasive this is too. We didn't talk about this when we read A Christmas Carol, but it's in there. There's, for example, the scene in which Scrooge breaks up with his fiancée, right? What's the sticking point between them? Does anybody remember why Scrooge and his fiancée separate? when he's looking back at his past. What does she not have?
Money.
Yeah, she doesn't have a dowry, right? So he won't gain anything from marriage to her, so she disinterestedly and kindly sets him free. And then we see her as the center of a happy household, right? We also see in the sort of the Christmas present scene when Scrooge is visiting the home of his nephew, that all of the sisters, all of Fred's wife's sisters, are scheming to get husbands, right? Because life for a middle-class woman is, in some way, if you're not married yet, was kind of, just kind of like a marriage market, What mattered was how marketable you were, or how able you were going to be to get a husband. Because women really were not taught the means to go out and work for themselves. Right. If you didn't find a husband, you were going to end up like Dorothy Wordsworth, dependent on a male relative, and eventually kind of sinking into mental illness in many cases. So Ellis's book is an example of a kind of popular writing that was called a conduct manual. And conduct manuals were written specifically for women. And they were intended to kind of like teach household management but also to initiate readers into proper middle-class social codes. Now, despite her own opinion of the intellectual abilities of women, Ellis's conduct manual is a little bit more cerebral than a lot of the others were. Many of them were just kind of like simple how-to books, whereas Ellis's actually has an ideology operating behind it, right? In fact, there's a point that I want to look at here. If we look on page 657, at the very bottom of the page, can I get somebody to start reading from "They may be less striking"? Right, very last sentence here.
Okay. They may be less striking in society than some of the women of other countries, and may feel themselves on brilliant and stirring occasions as simple, rude, and unsophisticated in the popular science of excitement. But as far as the noble daring of Britain has sent forth her adventurous sons, and that is to every point of danger on the habitable globe, they have borne along with them a generosity, a disinterestedness, and a moral courage derived in no small measure from the female influence of their native country.
Okay, thank you. So I think one thing to remember here is that the book is called The Women of England, right? And what is Ellis saying here about English women?
I mean, she's definitely set them apart in saying that they're the most noble women of the entire globe. Like the best
Okay, yeah.
women on the whole globe.
Yeah.
So they have to set themselves apart and be of this ideology that women are their spheres in the home and they're intellectually agree but morally superior. That all women of Britain should train themselves this way or train themselves this way.
And how does she say women best serve the nation here? What is the evidence of their service?
the evidence of their service is how Britain sends out the men to go conquer more parts of the empire.
Yeah.
Like the empire is so big because of women's influence.
So this links up with the imperial materials we were talking about last week as well, right? That Ellis is arguing that it's through the efforts of women in raising sons that go out into the colonies that England has been able to build an empire in the first place, right? So that disinterested kindness here that sons learn from their mothers is kind of like it's applied to that white man's burden ideology that we discussed when we looked briefly at that Kipling poem, right? You know, they learn to shoulder the difficulties they experience out in the empire patiently and disinterestedly from the efforts of their mothers. So there's a nationalist bent to Ellis's arguments as well, right? That you're not just serving as a moral compass for your husband and your children, but in doing so, you are providing a kind of moral counterweight to the wickedness of the whole world, right? You, British woman specifically. So what do you guys think of all this? I know it's a fairly large question to ask you.
I don't know, part of it, especially the way they suggest women should behave or the responsibilities of women, it seems a lot, like I said, I associate everything with something. I think that's how I have to like learn things. But it just seems like, I don't know if you're familiar with the show Gilmore Girls, the way Emily Gilmore is.
I'm aware of the show. I've never actually watched
Yes,
it.
the way Emily Gilmore is like to a T how women are supposed to behave according to Patmore, well, Ellis more so.
Well, this is a really long-lasting ideology, right? And it's an ideology that has not entirely died out either. You know, and it's we still find examples of this not only in media but also in contemporary family life. Yeah, I mean, like this has not gone away.
I think it's also has to do with the men standards as well. Like they can't be kind, you know. Like they get their kindness from the women. Like
Right.
it's also
Yeah.
You know.
Does it almost seem sometimes like they're kind of given a pass?
Yeah.
Associated
Like, I can be
kindness
rude,
and
'cause-
emotion with femininity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're definitely you're gendering qualities like kindness and patience,
Right.
and placing them up against qualities like intelligence and ambition, right? If you're smart and ambitious, then you can't be kind and patient, right?
It's also the assumption that all men are super intelligent. It's not always the case.
Okay, yeah, there are plenty of dummies of either gender, right? And in any social class. So, but yeah, I do want, like, before we kind of move on to kind of like one of the ways men were often kind of given a little bit of a pass in Victorian society, I do kind of want to look at what she says about men at the beginning of this, right? So can I get somebody to read for us on page 656 with the, just from the beginning of this, it starts with, "To men belongs the potence."
I can.
Thank you.
To men belongs the potent. I had almost said the omnipotent consideration of worldly
aggrandizement.
And it is consistently misleading their steps, closing their ears against the voice of conscience and beguiling them with the promise of peace where peace was never found.
Uh-huh. So men's work is naturally going to lead them astray, right? The fact that they're out in the world and the world is corrupt is always going to lead them to vice in some way, right? Now, one of the forms that this vice took frequently was adultery. And prostitution was kind of epidemic in Victorian Britain. So on the one hand, you have this surface facade of a highly moral society, right? But operating just underneath that facade is a great deal of exploitation. And what was I about to say? So the watchword of the period is not so much morality as respectability. So, don't even know what it means to be respectable. Or can you infer what respectability means from our conversation thus far? It's not the same thing as being moral.
I have like an idea of like what I know, but I don't know how to put it into words.
It's like, I mean, I guess my interpretation is like someone is like humbled to you because they see you as like a important like figure. I guess that's like the respect aspect, I guess.
Okay.
That's how I would see it.
I think also like adhering to the societal norms and like not breaking those and like in being kind of perfectly in line with where you were supposed to be.
That's largely what it's being perfectly in line, at least on the surface, right? Being perceived as being perfectly in line with conventional social norms, right? Which means if you're a middle-class man, you can step out on your wife, you can consort with prostitutes, and as long as no one sees you doing it, that's fine, right? No one's going to call you out on it. But the moment someone recognizes what you're doing, the moment someone realizes, or like the moment you publicly take a wrong step, that's when trouble starts for you, right? So a case in point, in the late Victorian period, in the 1890s, Oscar Wilde, whose play is going to be in the GSW Fine Arts Theater this weekend. In fact, like when this play was still in its first production in London, Wilde was publicly a married family man. Privately, and most people actually knew this, but as long as he never publicly acknowledged the fact, he was fine, Wilde was gay. And he was involved in a relationship with a young nobleman. And this young nobleman's father sent an insulting message to Wilde. He sent him a bouquet of rotten vegetables at the opening of The Importance of Being Earnest, and left an insulting card for Wilde at the club that they both belonged to. Wilde chose to sue this man, the Marquis of Queensberry, for libel. And because he did this, then that secret life that everybody actually knew about but publicly pretended not to came out into the papers, and Wilde's life and career were ruined, right? So he was no longer able to maintain that facade of respectability because he could no longer pretend to be the normal, conventional Victorian man, right? Not that he was publicly that conventional anyway. He kind of played around a lot with conventions and social norms, but yeah, any shred of respectability is kind of torn away from him in that moment, right? Now, respectability, remember, is a middle class ideology. The aristocracy can pretty much do whatever the hell they want. And working class people were also, they were held to the same standards by the middle class, but typically were not able to kind of live those particular standards, right? And I think that's part of the point of this anonymous letter that I had you read as well, right? So this letter purports to be written by a prostitute working in London. And what did you all get from this? Like, what is the basic argument that she's making?
I think on the surface, she's arguing for kind of like the normalization of sex work, but at the same time,
Okay, yeah.
really,
If we were putting this into a contemporary framework, yeah, that
Yes.
seems to be what. Yeah.
But I feel as though she's arguing against that respectability.
Uh-huh.
Is like how are you going to perceive yourself as being this upright, fine citizen, but then you, for one, the men are coming to, reap the benefits of my work, but then
Yeah.
also you're not that good of a person either because you're holding me to this standard, but the opportunities aren't. We don't have the same opportunities that you have. You've literally built I can't remember what the author wrote. You built basically like a barrier between our worlds, and you refuse to connect them at all. But then you choose to hold me to a standard and look at me as some vile person in society.
So yeah, so what's the argument she's making really about? Is it really about prostitution?
No.
What is it actually about?
I think in some ways, like, she feels like misunderstood. Like,
Okay.
there's a big, like, she talks about virtue at least,
Uh-huh.
like, for a solid 2 paragraphs, and then I think she brings it back up at other points
Yeah.
as well, and was like, where I come from, nobody has it to begin with. So, like,
Yeah, and I think she has a very
It's weird.
specific definition of virtue, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on what you were saying.
oh, no, you're fine.
Her definition of virtue is very specific. Were you able to figure out what she means exactly by virtue?
I would assume she's talking about virginity.
Yeah, that's what she's talking about. Yeah, virtue in terms of virginity or chastity, right?
And she said, I know it would like to be thought that I lost it, but really I gave it away.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And again, like, the reason why this is such a big deal in this period is some of this, like, kind of pseudo-medieval ideology, right? So, why are men so concerned with women's chastity? Well, because they want to make sure the offspring they're raising are their own, right? And so this kind of brings into focus here that kind of opposite number of the angel in the house that I was talking about, right? You have on the one hand the good Victorian middle class woman who keeps a happy home and provides a moral compass for her husband and is chaste and faithful, and the opposite number is referred to as the fallen woman. Now, one thing I do want to kind of make clear about both of these tropes is that the extent to which either of them actually existed is debatable, right? they're mostly kind of literary and artistic constructs. But literary and artistic constructs do have a great deal of influence on our actual behavior, right? To go back to Oscar Wilde, right? One of his famous lines is that, he turns around the idea that art imitates life. It's like, no, life imitates art. And I think that, he's trying to make a joke there, but it is like, it's a joke like most of his jokes that contains a kind of profound truth, right? That we are, in fact, deeply influenced. Our behavior is actually shaped by the art and media that we consume. And so the fallen woman is essentially any middle-class woman who has committed some sort of sexual impropriety and been found out. And because of this, well, how do you think society would treat her then? And use Oscar Wilde as an example, as a kind of maybe to kind of assist your guess here, right? Once a woman has been caught committing some sort of sexual impropriety, how do you think middle-class society is expected to respond to her?
You expect them to shun her, and
Good word, yes. Shun. Shun. Yes. She is not to be pitied. She is not to be brought back into the fold.
definitely villainized.
Yes, she is irredeemable and must be cast out, right? She's making everyone look bad. And so the conventional fallen woman narrative, right, has her cast out of the home and wandering the streets, perhaps with an infant in tow, right, as the symbol of her shame, and becoming a prostitute until she finally drinks herself to death or commits suicide or some other such thing, right? So it's a kind of tragic narrative. It's a representation of, literally like a fall, right? A fall from grace.
It's like a cycle with the courtly love thing, in a way.
Uh-huh.
It's like the knight gets with her, and then it's seen as her fault in a way.
If they're caught, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's, and what the anonymous letter here, the great social evil, is responding to is another letter writer who had written to the London Times a couple months earlier and she claimed that she was a middle-class woman who had fallen in exactly this way, right? And so what the letter writer here is attempting to do is correct that narrative and say, like, no, like, that doesn't usually happen. That's not where actual prostitutes come from. They come from the working class, and we end up doing it because the only rich, pretty people we ever see, the only people we ever see who look happy, are prostitutes. Right? Note that she talks about these visitors who would come back to the neighborhood, bedecked in fancy clothes, throwing money around. Right? Think about like a rapper or a basketball star, right? Coming back to the neighborhood where they grew up. Right? They don't live there anymore because they don't have to. But yeah, they go around. They're spending money, buying people drinks. Buy my mom a house or a car, right? And then they leave again. And there's that glamour that they radiate that attracts young people and makes them think this is a viable path out, right? And that's kind of the same thing that's happening to this girl as she describes her childhood experiences, right? So she doesn't have any other examples of wealth and comfort to follow. Right? The only example she has of somebody who looks like they're actually making it in the world is someone who is doing something that society regards as vice. And so I think what she is trying to argue here is that prostitution is less a moral problem and more an economic problem, right? It happens not because the lower classes are naturally vicious, and not because middle class women fall afoul of, respectability rules, right? But because poor people don't want to be poor anymore. And she talks about this Society for the Suppression of Vice. So let me just kind of mention quickly who these people, and this is going to be where we finish up, who these people are, because even they're important to understanding the period, right? So the Society for the Suppression of Vice is founded in 1802 and is active until 1885. And they're formed out of an earlier organization called the Society for the Reform of Manners. Now that should also tell us something about their concerns and what they consider to be vice, right? What are manners?
Like
We all know
polite behavior towards
polite
other people.
Yeah, and who dictates what polite behavior is?
Society.
Yeah, and in particular, what we consider manners, we consider good manners or polite manners, right? Not talking with your mouth full, right? Don't scratch your ass in public. If you have to belch, excuse yourself, right? Don't do certain things in front of other people. Hold doors for ladies, things of that nature, right? What this is, it's imitations of upper class codes of behavior, right? So the fact that this is formed out of a group called the Society for the Reform of Manners kind of tells us about what kind of worldview they're trying to impose, right? What we have is a group of middle class people who want to impose a particular view of manners onto the working classes, right? So their primary concerns, they're motivated, by the way, in this early period by what they see as the excesses of the French Revolution and all of that kind of social leveling that's going on. They're concerned about obscene or blasphemous publications. Businesses that are open on Sundays. Places where people drink or gamble. And prostitution. And the complaint that this letter writer has about the Society for the Suppression of Vice is largely that she feels like they blame her unfairly for the path she has taken in the world. And rather than trying to reform the economic systems that put her there, they simply try to reform her behavior. So we're about out of time, but does anybody have any questions about any of this? I know I've thrown a lot of material at you today, and this is a lot to process.
Not necessarily a question, but the way women are seen, especially the angel in the house, term. It
Uh-huh.
seems kind of the way Edmund Burke would describe Queen
Marie Antoinette. Yeah.
as being
Yeah.
this being, and how was it 1,000 soldiers should have left to
Yes.
protect her or something that way.
That is a really good observation. Yes.
It seemed like that kind of carried over. It was altered a little bit, but it seemed
Mhm.
it definitely carried over from.
Yeah. I mean, and it is like it's arising from that same that concept of chivalry. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's the you use that slightly larger brain.
3.5 pounds.
As opposed to like 2 pounds and 11 ounces. I know. Such an important difference.
Right.